Nice to see everybody here this evening. My name's Doug Larkin. I'm chairman of the Historical Society of the Town of Clarence. And on behalf of the officers and the trustees, we'd like to welcome you tonight. We have a really thrilling program in store with Rick, so we'll look forward to that. Also, from the Town of Clarence this evening, we have Councilman Daniel Michnick in the back. And I gotta mention past Councilman Bob Geiger, who's always a supporter of the society, so thank you. Rick Falkowski has been here before, and we enjoy his programs. He's an area author and lecturer on Buffalo history and Buffalo music. So without further, and he does have books available that he's written, and they will be available for purchase after the program. So with that said, I'll turn it over to Rick.
That was quick. I think the last time you introduced me, I was sitting there going, now who is this guy? Is he eventually going to talk, or is he just going to talk about him? You know. So I'd like to welcome everybody here. I'm glad to be back. I always say to everybody, this is one of my favorite places to give talks, because I love this building. You know, it was built in 1911, the Automobile Club of Buffalo became the AAA. In fact, this is one of the 250 buildings that's inside of my new book. You know, so I loved it. In fact, the AAA actually gave me a picture, which I used, that it was taken when they were there, like an old Mercedes or something like that, in front of us. So I love this place. In fact, a lot of times when I say I'm giving talks, I use this as what my talks look like, because they make them look better than they really are. So I think maybe I owe you guys a commission for some of the talks that I end up getting, I'm not sure. Okay, well anyways, I'm giving a talk today about my Spirit of Buffalo Women book. Why did I write a book called Spirit of Buffalo Women? Very simple. When I was doing all my research for all my first books, I found out that in like the early 1900s, women almost didn't exist. In fact, society made it seem like they didn't exist. If your name was Doris Jones and you got married to John Smith, who did you become? Mrs. John Smith. Doris went away, she was gone. It wasn't before the days where it could be Mrs. Doris Jones Smith, like a lot of people do today. In fact, I always say I wish I changed it around. I'd rather have my wife's last name. Her last name is Eldridge. I think it sounds better than Falkowski. It's more historic, you know. In fact, her grandfather lived on Ransom Road for a number of years. And in the double, the White House, in fact, her grandfather's father was at one time the supervisor. There's some politicians here, so this is interesting to you guys. He was the supervisor for the town of Marilla. In fact, in Marilla, there's a road called Eldridge Road. Back then, there was no such thing as the Erie County Legislature. It was the Erie County Board of Supervisors. So, Mr. Eldridge, I think his name was Ben Eldridge, in like the early 1900s, was named the supervisor, in charge of the supervisors, so he was actually the county executive. So I didn't know that, because I would have been afraid to approach my wife if that were the case. Even though I am friends with Mark Polikar's girlfriends, you know. In fact, what's funny is she worked for my grandson at one time. Think about that one. That shows you how old I am. Okay. Well, anyways, when I give my talks, I take my book about Buffalo women. And I covered 60 women, like I said, because women weren't covered. That's why I decided to write a book about them. And I normally break it into two separate talks, each with 30 people. One's about arts and entertainment, the other one is about society and culture. I come here once a year to give a talk, so that's when I give talks on a regular basis for places. So what I did is I said to Sarah, pick 40 people. This way we can have a combination of arts and entertainment and society and culture in today's talk. So that's what we're going to have. The talk's going to be 40 people, so the talk will probably take about an hour. And as I preface all my talks, and if you've seen me before, probably most of you have, you'll remember I have 3 goals. Goal number 1, I'm going to talk about some things you never knew before. Goal number 2, I'm going to bring up some things that you knew before but you forgot about. Like, who did you come here with today? Did you have breakfast? And goal number 3, which is really the most important, when you leave my talk and you hear about all these phenomenal women that came from Buffalo and Western New York, the phenomenal things that they did, you're going to say, I am proud to be from Buffalo. So when I finish my talk, I'm going to ask you to test me if I accomplish all my goals. And if I accomplish all my goals, you are then required to buy some books. Okay, so we're going to start out with somebody right from around here. Keziah Ransom. Why are we going to start out with Keziah Ransom? Very simple. Can I adjust this microphone right? Is this loud enough? No? No, see, if I got to get closer, then I can't see what I got written. So it's not working out. This is what happens, number 1, when you get to be 74 years old, and number 2, you're Polish. I still don't understand why my wife married me. I think she didn't see my last name when she met me, so she said, I guess it's okay. You know, but she was from the Upper West Side, and I was from Cheektowaga, so she should have known. You know, of course I had some flamingos on my shirt, but she didn't notice that. Well, everybody knows Asa Ransom. Here, who didn't eat at the Asa Ransom house? And as you know, it's not the Asa Ransom house. Well, anyways, and so they moved to Western New York before the year 1800. Why is that significant? Because in the year 1800, there was only 3 houses in the village of Buffalo. Okay, and so when the Ransoms moved, they were the 4th house that was built in downtown Buffalo. I don't know if you could call it downtown back then, but still, it was the 4th house. It was on the corner of Main and Exchange. And Asa Ransom was a silversmith. He sold to the Haudenosaunee Indians. He had dealt with them when he lived in the Finger Lakes before he moved up here. And the Howland Land Company said, if somebody is willing to open a tavern, we will sell you land for $2 an acre. Why is it that if somebody was going to open a tavern, very simple, it's Western New York, no, very simple, back then, a tavern was everything. The tavern was the tavern, the hotel, the community center, the political center, the senior center, you name it, the tavern was everything. So, Asa Ransom said, I gotta leave downtown Buffalo and go out to Clarence. And he said, I think I'll do that. So, they bought 150 acres of land at $2 an acre. That means for $300 they bought Clarence. Does anybody here live in Spalding Lake? Because in Spalding Lake, I think you can just buy a few blades of grass for $300, not the entire village. Well, anyways, Asa Ransom got well known because when they lived in Buffalo, Keziah had a baby girl. So Asa Ransom was known as the father of the first female Caucasian child born in Western New York, not on a military base. They moved to Clarence. She had a baby boy. Asa Ransom was known as the father of the first male Caucasian child born in Erie County. Everybody's talking about Asa. Ladies, who had more to do with the birth of that baby? Asa might have contributed, but Keziah did all the work. So I make a motion, politicians here, that we change the name of the Asa Ransom House to the Keziah Ransom House effective in 2026. So she's starting off, it's perfect, but we're in, Clarence, and Asa Ransom's the first person that I'm going to be mentioning. The next person I'm going to talk about is a lady by the name of Margaret St. John. Margaret St. John ended up moving to the Western New York area, and they moved to Williamsville. They ended up renting a mill from a guy by the name of Williams. And that was Williams Mill, so that's how it ended up getting the name Williamsville. So they decided they wanted to move to the big city. So in probably about 1809, 1810, they moved to Buffalo. And what did they do? They opened a tavern because they were going to sell chicken wings. No, they opened a tavern because everybody wanted taverns. That's what everybody wanted. So they moved there, and after they moved there, her eldest son ended up dying from disease because the American troops were stationed there. Her husband and her second oldest son both died delivering supplies to the Americans who had captured Fort Erie on the other side up in Canada. Well, the Americans did a no-no. During the war, they burned Niagara-on-the-Lake. You do not burn down civilian houses during a war. It's against the rules. I can't believe you got rules in wars. Anyways, but so the British retaliated. They came across the Niagara River, they took over Fort Niagara, they burned Lewiston, they burned Youngstown, they ended up burning Manchester. Does anybody remember Manchester? That's Niagara Falls, that's what it used to be called. It was called Manchester at one time. And then they ended up going back into Canada, they crossed over, they ended up burning Black Rock, they made their way to Buffalo. Buffalo gallantly tried to defend themselves. They fired one volley with their cannon at the British coming from Black Rock to Buffalo, and the cannon broke. So the military all ran away. The English got control of Buffalo. Well, they got to Mrs. St. John's house, and they said, "Get out, we're burning your house down." She said, "Look, General Lyle, I've lost my 2 sons and my husband already in this war. You are not going to burn down my house." Sarah Lovejoy lived across the street. She lived across the street where the Tift House was later built, which later became Hager's Department Store. Anybody remember Hager's Department Store? Okay. And so she argued, and Sarah Lovejoy was the only woman killed during the attack on Buffalo. They did not burn down Margaret St. John's home. There was only 3 buildings not burned down when the British burned Buffalo. And they were the blacksmith shop. Why? There's fires inside of there all the time. The jail, because it's supposed to be made so you can't get out by burning it down. And Mrs. St. John's house. They ended up helping everybody when they rebuilt Buffalo. They were the only ones there. So Mrs. St. John was really, you could say, one of the heroes of the War of 1812. Now, Buffalo's really lucky to have 2 people that became presidents of the United States. Hell with this. But it's 2 people who became presidents of the United States that lived in the Buffalo area. One of them was Abigail Fillmore. Abigail Fillmore was the wife of Millard Fillmore. And they met when Abigail Fillmore was Millard Fillmore's teacher. Oh. Sounds a little off color to me. Well, there was a difference. School back then, she was only 1 year older than Millard. So I guess it was okay. She didn't lose her job. Okay? And so they ended up, the Fillmore family moved to East Aurora. They were like the 2nd or 3rd family that lived in East Aurora. Millard moved there with his father and mother, and he ended up building this house. You can see the house there in the top right-hand corner. And that's the only house still standing today that was hand-built by a president of the United States. But he built that for Abigail. So when they got married, they lived there. That house was next door to where the Aurora Theater is today. Across the street was Millard Fillmore's law office. Across the street from that is what? Bidler's 5 and 10. So Millard Fillmore's law office was inside of Bidler's 5 and 10. That means his law costs were not that high. Everything was 5 or 10 cents. You want to sue somebody? Give me a dime. Okay. Well, anyways, Millard Fillmore was not known as a great president of the United States. He signed the Treaty of 1850, and a lot of bad things happened because of that, so he's really not looked upon as a great president. However, Abigail's looked upon as one of the most important first ladies in American history. Why? When they moved to the White House, there was no library. She started the library. When they moved to the White House, people didn't come and talk and give performances there. Abigail invited people like Washington Irving, Charles Dickens, and Jenny Lind to speak at the White House. First person to do that. Also, what's the First Lady known for? The First Lady always works in educational matters. What was Abigail? A school teacher. So she started all the things that the First Lady did. Unfortunately, at the inauguration of Fillmore's person that took his place, she caught pneumonia and died 26 days after the end of his term. Millard came back to Buffalo and became really the first citizen of Buffalo, but unfortunately Abigail passed away. Now, Harriet Tubman, she was born into slavery in the 1820s in Maryland. Yes, Maryland was a slave state. And her mother was set free in the will of her plantation owner, but the new owner said, "No, I'm not honoring that." So she remained being a slave. In 1849, she escaped with her brother. She ended up going to Baltimore. And in Baltimore, she ended up getting a job as a housekeeper. But she didn't want to do that. She wanted to help people escape slavery. So she worked in something that was called the Underground Railroad. And Harriet Tubman was considered one of the best people in the Underground Railroad. They believed 300 enslaved people were freed because of her. You can only prove 70 of them, but still 300 is a possibility. How good was she? Now this is back in the 1850s. The plantation owners offered a $40,000 reward for the capture of Harriet Tubman. How much $40,000 was in the 1850s? That's about as much as you guys are paying me for giving a talk today. And anyways, she worked with the Underground Railroad. In fact, she came directly to Buffalo because she helped her parents, after the Fugitive Slave Act went into effect, go up to St. Catherine. So she went there. She also worked with the Cataract House in Niagara Falls, which is the main place for enslaved people to get up into Canada. And during the Civil War, she worked as a spy for the North. And she helped the American troops win battles. In fact, after the Civil War, she actually got a pension from the American government. Okay, maybe, listen, I don't know if this is right, but who knows, maybe she was the first female to actually get a pension from being in service. Mary Elizabeth Johnson Lord, quite a name, and quite an important name, because her father was Ebenezer Johnson. Ebenezer Johnson was the first mayor of Buffalo, and her husband was Reverend Lord, who was a minister at the Presbyterian Church. Well, in New England, somebody started an organization called the SPCA, Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Well, they called Milton Fillmore because they always started great things in areas. And he said, I'm too busy. I'm starting the University of Buffalo and Museum of Science. And he said, but speak to Mrs. Lord. And so they spoke to her. So she started the first SPCA in Buffalo, which was really the second SPCA in the entire United States. Where was it? Buffalo, New York. Okay, now what did they treat back then? Dogs and cats? No. They took care of horses. Because horses were everything. And people's main pets back in them days were goldfish and parakeets. Okay? And Buffalo was lucky enough to have a director years ago called Barbara Carr. Barbara Carr was the director of the SPCA in Buffalo for a number of years. In fact, she transformed the Buffalo SPCA to a no-kill shelter. And today, the SPCA, which started with Mary Elizabeth Johnson Lord having a few guys, dog catchers with nets, and a carriage pulled by horses, to having 100 employees and over 1,200 volunteers. So where was the second place there was an SPCA? Buffalo, New York. Most of you probably heard the name Maria Love. Now, Maria Love was, really indicative of a lot of the wealthy people in the Western New York area during the mid-1800s. Anybody of affluence really tried to do things for other people within the area. And Maria Love traveled extensively with a family called the Carey family. Now, the Carey family lived in that little house over there you can see on the far right-hand side. Just a little place. They didn't like this house, so they traveled all around the world on a regular basis. No, they loved the house, but they loved to travel. But when Maria Love was in France, she saw that working women would take their children to a place where they would watch their kids while they were working. So she brought that concept back to Buffalo. And she opened the first daycare center in the United States in Buffalo, New York. Okay, it was over in a place called Fish Creek, which is on the corner of Swan Street and Elmer Oak. And you can see a picture of the building right there, right before it was torn down. And till this day, they still have the Maria Love Charity Ball to raise funds for medical care for needy residents of the Western New York area. I mentioned Buffalo was lucky to have two presidents, so we were lucky to have two first ladies. Okay, story about Frances Folsom Cleveland is very, very interesting because Frances Folsom Cleveland's father was Grover Cleveland's law partner. So they worked together. In fact, when Frances Folsom Cleveland was born, Grover Cleveland bought her first baby carriage. And then her father ended up dying in a tragic accident, his carriage crashed. And Cleveland was appointed the administrator of his estate. And so he became the guardian of his daughter, Frances. Well, Frances lived on Edward Street. Now, if you know anything about me, I get directions by restaurants and bars. That's basically across the street from Founding Fathers. Okay, you know where Founding Fathers is, now you know where that is, okay? And so word got around that Cleveland was going to be marrying Mrs. Folsom. Well, everybody thought he was going to be marrying his former law partner's wife. But no, it was announced when they were in Europe that he was going to be marrying the daughter, who was 21 years old and he was 48. So there was 27 years difference in age. And when she landed back in the States, she was mobbed by people in New York City because she was going to become the first lady. They got married in the White House. The only president ever to get married inside of the White House. There's a picture that took place on June 2nd of 1886. And it was a very great marriage. They had 5 children during their marriage. And I always thought the Babe Ruth candy bar was named for who? The famous baseball player. The Babe Ruth candy bar was named for Baby Ruth, the daughter of Frances Folsom Cleveland. Now, Bethel Lockwood, okay, she grew up in Royalton. She taught school, and she was literate at the age of 22. So she decided, I'm going to further my education. She went to Gasport Academy, and then she graduated from the very prestigious Genesee College. Yeah, huh? Genesee, very prestigious. Oh, it's now called Syracuse University. Okay, so I guess it is prestigious, okay. And she returned to be headmaster at the Lockport schools. She moved to Washington, D.C. When she got to Washington, she decided, I want to become an attorney. And this one law school opened up their school for women to become attorneys. Well, she enrolled in the school, she was accepted. When she was accepted, all the male students inside of that college protested. They said, we don't want to go to school with a woman to be an attorney because women aren't smart enough to be attorneys. You like that? Mm-hmm. Okay, well, anyway, so she ended up graduating, going through a lot of hell, you could say, during the years of law school. When she graduated, all the guys in the class said, we're not graduating with her. So what did she do? She walked down the street, knocked on the front door of the White House. Ulysses S. Grant answered the door. Now, can you imagine Trump answering the door of the White House? Do you think Biden knew where the front door was in the White House? Well, anyways, Grant answered the door himself, and he said, what do you want? What can I do for you? He probably had a cigar in his mouth, the general and everything. He told her the whole story. He said, that's totally wrong. So he made sure that everybody graduated with her. So she graduated, became an attorney. After she became an attorney, she won a $5 million settlement for the Cherokee Nation, because their civil rights were, taken advantage of. But then, in 1884, she decided to run for president. Okay, now, she was on a party called the Equal Rights Party. There's a picture of her campaign poster. You know what one of her campaign slogans were? I can't vote, but you can vote for me. She still got a couple thousand votes. That's pretty good, okay? Anna Catherine Green wasn't born in Buffalo, but her father married a woman from Buffalo and she moved here. She went to school here. And after she graduated from high school, she went to college and she wanted to become a poet. Well, she was a single woman. Is there much money in being a poet? Not then and not now. Poets don't make anything, okay? And but so what she did is she wrote a book called The Leavenworth Case. That was based on her father because her father was an attorney. So it ended up being, believe it or not, the first detective novel written. It was the first detective novel written in the United States. And it was written by who? A woman from Buffalo, New York. Okay? She ended up marrying Charles Rolls, a famous furniture designer. Okay? And some of his furniture is in Buckingham Palace. And some of his chairs cost like, 6 figures. I'm still going around to all the garage sales trying to find one of the shares, and I haven't been able to, unfortunately. But you ever hear of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle? Who did he write? Sherlock Holmes. When Doyle came to the United States, he specifically came to Buffalo, New York. Why? He wanted to meet Anna Catherine Green because she influenced him to write detective books. Any of you ever read a novel by Agatha Christie? Agatha Christie said she never would have written a book if it wasn't for Anna Catherine Green. In fact, that's her house on Park Street in the Allentown area. As I said, directions, it's right near Gabriel's Gate. Okay. Great food over there. Okay, and that house may become a National Historic House because of where it's located. Now, Sarah Hinson was a school teacher in Buffalo, New York. She taught at School 31 on Emsley. And she was there for 50 years, 30 years as a teacher, and another 20 years as a principal. What she did is she noticed her children had no respect for the American flag. Sound familiar? Some of the stuff that's going on today? But what she did is she found out that on June 14th, the Continental Congress accepted the design of the American flag. Who designed the American flag? Wrong. Buy the book, you're going to find out who really did it. And anyway, so she had everybody pledge allegiance to the flag. So one of the founders of Flag Day in the United States is a teacher from a school on the east side of Buffalo. What city? Buffalo, New York. Okay. Charlotte? Oh, no, we don't have the person in there. Okay. You didn't want her. Okay. Louise Blanchard Bethune is important because she was the first female architect in America. In fact, she designed the Lafayette Hotel. She also designed a whole bunch of schools and an armory, which became the Elmwood Music Hall. Now, she also campaigned for women's rights. Before the Pan American Exhibition, there was the Chicago World's Fair. They had a contest. Men and women designing buildings. They had a first prize for men, $5,000. They had a first prize for women, $500. They asked Bethune to participate. She said, go to hell. You make it the same or else we don't play. She taught all the other women into doing that. They ended up making it one contest for males and females alike with $5,000 going to the winner. So not only was she the first architect, she also did a lot for women's rights in the United States. Evelyn Rumsey Carey. Rumseys are important. Why? Because they were the richest family in Buffalo. And does that poster in the middle look familiar? On the far end look familiar? That's the Spirit of Niagara. The Spirit of Niagara was the poster for the Pan American Exhibition. When I wrote my book about Buffalo women, my first book had a cover like this. My second book had a cover like this. My editor said, Rick, if you're going to write a book about women, it's got to be a pretty book. You don't do a women's book unless it's a pretty book. So, I got a hold of a graphic artist. He took the design of the Spirit of Niagara, and we changed it so we couldn't get sued. But I paid Paul for doing this, so if anybody sues me, Paul gets sued, not me. Okay? And so it's a pretty cover. In fact, a lot of people said they bought this book because they liked the cover. They never said anything about my writing. Well, anyways, so we sort of took that. She also designed the poster for women's suffrage, for voting rights. Okay, now the people I talked about really did great things. Annie Hudson Taylor is not somebody that really did great things. She's somebody that I consider she was a little bit loose. Okay, she was a school teacher. Her husband died. Anybody here former school teacher? You're a whole bunch usually, but anyways, now you get decent pensions. Okay, back then teachers got nothing. Okay, so her husband died. She says, I'm going to be a poor widow. What am I going to do? And she says, aha, Blondani walks across a wire over Niagara Falls. The Pan American Exhibition's going on. On my 63rd birthday, I'm going to go to Niagara Falls and go over the falls in a barrel. Then I can travel around the United States and get paid a lot of money because everybody's going to say, what a great, brave woman, what a daredevil. She went over the falls in a barrel. So she came to Buffalo, and like I said, she was a little loose, but she wasn't stupid. Okay, that's a picture of her over there with the barrel. What's on top? Her cat. 2 days before she went over the falls, she sent her cat over the falls in the barrel. The barrel survived, the cat survived. She said, I could do it. Because of that, my wife hates her. Because according to my wife, cats are people too. Okay, so she ended up going over the falls. There's her being saved. She survived. But what happened? When she was in the hospital recuperating, her unscrupulous manager hired a 21-year-old girl and stole her barrel and went around the vaudeville circuit and made a whole bunch of money saying this is the woman that went over the falls. Okay, what happened to Annie Edson Taylor? She was relegated to signing autographs on postcards and stuff like that in the Niagara Falls area. She died in poverty in 1921, and she was buried in what's called Stunter's Rest at the Oakwood Cemetery in Niagara Falls. That's an area that's reserved for a whole bunch of daredevils that died when they went over the falls. I always ask them to make sure, if a daredevil lived when they went over the falls, did they wait until they died until they buried them, or did they bury them anyways? Well, they said they buried all the daredevils there, so I don't know. Okay. Well, Mary, once again, you changed it. I don't have all the people in here. Okay. Catherine Pratt Horton was the daughter of Pascal Pratt. Pascal Pratt was the founder of the first store in Buffalo. His grandsons founded Pratt and Letchworth and also M&T Bank. For 50 years, she was considered the grand dame of Buffalo society. She started the Buffalo Federation of Women's Clubs and was on the board of governors of the Pan Am. She ended up donating her house, that's the middle picture, to the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution. And the picture on the far left-hand side is her standing right next to McKinley. That's the last photo taken before McKinley was assassinated. So Horton was next to her, and there's the house today. It's still there on Delaware Avenue for the Daughters of the American Revolution. Mary Cass is important because she was the first female manufacturing executive in the United States. She graduated from Central High School in Buffalo. Okay, in 1891, she took a job at the F. N. Bird Company for $5 a week. That wouldn't even buy lunch today. And she's probably working 50 hours a week for that too. Well, she ended up going through various positions, and she eventually became the general manager and the vice president of the company. It was important because the F. N. Bird Company made boxes. They specialized in small boxes, pretty boxes, like pretty books for women. They were doing boxes for the Larkin Company. Well, a new company started in California and said, we're going to be making perfumes. Would you like to make our boxes? And I can guarantee you that all the women here have one of the boxes in their house. So they then made all the boxes for Avon. So the Avon boxes were all made right here by F. N. Bird Company, and Mary Cass was the person that ran it. Now, I love this. Mary Cass was an avid golfer. You can see her right there. And she also owned her own car. A lot of men had chauffeurs. They couldn't even drive their own car, but Mary could actually fix her own car. That's her office. I never had an office like that. Okay, now the Knox family. Everybody knows the Knox family. They started something called Woolworths Corporation. They invented the 5 and 10. That's stores where you could actually get your own stuff and everything like that. Well, when Seymour died, he was building a house on 800 Delaware Avenue. He passed away before it was done, so his wife ended up moving in there, Grace Millard Knox. And she moved in there with her children. That house was so big that during the winter time, it ended up taking 1 to 2 tons of coal a day just to heat the place. Can you imagine having that as a job? You know, and talk about having a whole bunch of labor. And inside of that home, Mary Millard Knox started something called the Junior League of Buffalo. And the Junior League of Buffalo has their show house every year. One year, the Knox Mansion in East Aurora was the show house, but 5 years ago, that house on Delaware Avenue was the show house for the Junior League. Where was the show house this year? The Urban Mansion in Chickawaga next to Villa College. And Mary Portia Conjure Goodyear. Now, the Goodyears are one of the very, very affluent families in Western New York area. Charles Goodyear ran the Goodyear Lumber Company. In fact, he was best friends with Grover Cleveland. In fact, Ella and her husband were the first people to visit Cleveland when he was in the White House, and they were regular overnight guests there. Well, she raised her children at 723 Delaware Avenue, and they also built a mansion at 888 Delaware. That's the mansion you can see right here. Her son, Anson Conger Goodyear, influenced Seymour Knox to become involved with the art gallery, changing the name to the Albright Knox Art Gallery. And he also went on to be the first president of the Museum of Modern Arts in New York City. The Goodyear home, if it looks familiar, became the Blue Cross building, and later became Bishop McMahon High School. And the Oracle Charter School is now being turned into apartments. Now, Florence Went is one of the reasons why I wrote this book. Because when I was looking into the founding of the Buffalo Philharmonic, I found out that the founder was Mrs. Edgar Went. And she founded it along with guys by the name of Burge, Capon, and Sleep. But it was always Mrs. Edgar Went. Well, he was important because his father was one of the founders of Buffalo Forge. But why didn't they call her Florence Went? Okay? Because think of it, the Buffalo Philharmonic. Who started it? A lady by the name of Mrs. Florence Went. If we wouldn't have had her in Buffalo to get that whole thing going, the other people wouldn't have gone along with doing everything to get what we have today. Now, two people that went to the concerts at the original home of the Philharmonic, which is the Elmwood Music Hall, happened to be Mary Seton and Edgar Kleinhans. Mary Seton was the Southern Belle that came to Buffalo. They went to all the concerts. They didn't have any children. So when they passed away, they donated all their money to the city of Buffalo. And we went from having the worst concert hall to having one of the best acoustic concert halls in the entire country. Who do we attribute that to? Mary Seton Kleinhans. What's the second room in Kleinhans called? The Mary Seton room. And Margaret Went, her father was the other founder of Buffalo Forge. Now, when her father passed away, he ended up leaving everything to Margaret and her mother. And Margaret ended up taking all that money, and with the assistance of her pastor, she ended up starting the Margaret Went Foundation. And she started that in 1957. Everybody knows the Margaret Went Foundation. What you don't know is Margaret Went suffered a stroke in 1959. She was in a coma for 13 years. So Margaret Went never really realized everything she did with the money that she ended up donating. Kay Butler married the son of the founder of the Buffalo News, Edward Butler Jr. In fact, he ended up taking over the paper, and Kate ended up helping with everything that was done. And Kate was, not a passive person. She helped with everything. And along with the newspaper, they started something called WBEN Radio, one of the first radio stations in Western New York. What does that stand for? Buffalo Evening News. They started WBEN TV in 1948. We complained that when we were young, there was only 3 television stations. But from 1948 to 1953, there was one television station, and that was Channel 4, WBEN, owned by who? The Butler family. And they also started the first FM station. Now, when her husband passed away, she ended up running the company, and 200 Main Street is where the Buffalo News building was. In fact, Kate's the one that picked out the new building that the Buffalo News had downtown near the stadium arena. Well, the Buffalo News isn't there anymore. In fact, I wonder, is the Buffalo News still in Buffalo? No, not at all. I have a lot of friends that used to work there. Well, anyway, so Mary Kate would go to 200 Main Street. She would have her chauffeur park in front of the building in her Rolls Royce. So everybody would know, Kate's in the building. Remember Doris Jones? Doris Jones was the first woman from Western New York in television. So if she was the first woman in television, what channel was she on first? 4, because that was the first one. For 5 years, it was the only one. Okay, well, when she was a teenager, she went to Amherst High School, and she was a model for AM&A's and Hanger stores. But she wanted to take that a little bit further. She wanted to learn how to speak. So she ended up going to Studio Arena for elocution training. And she ended up doing commercials. In fact, there's a commercial of her doing an advertisement for a newfangled device called the Icebox. And that was in the 1940s. So what channel was that on? Channel 4. Okay, she then got a job on Channel 7. Right when Channel 7 went on the air, it was a show called For the Ladies. And then in 1965, she was hired by Channel 2 to be the weather gal. That sounds politically incorrect today. You don't call somebody a weather gal. But when they hired her as a weather gal, they didn't realize that they had to make her a full-time employee. So she was the first female full-time employee of any television station in Buffalo. So she worked at 4, she worked on 7, and then she worked in Channel 2. Now, I remember when I was little when she used to do the weather. Okay, that's when she used to put up a sunny face for the sun, and then the clouds blowing and everything like that. And I used to watch the weather all the time, wondering if the decals were going to fall off the map. Inevitably, most of them did. But when I finally got to meet her, she told me that she womanized the weather set. She brought her fresh flowers every day. Well, her and her husband also owned a ski rack. Remember that at one time, that was the only place to buy skis in Western New York. So Channel 2 started a thing where they had a helicopter go up and they did ski reports. They asked all the guys that worked at Channel 2, would you go up in the helicopter and do it? And they all said no. So Doris said, I'll do it. And she told me, now when I met her, she was in her 80s. The men didn't have the nerve to go up there and do it, but she didn't use the word nerve. And she ended up coming to my release of my woman's book at the Buffalo History Museum. And after I talked about her, well, before she came, she called me every day for a week, saying, Rick, I'm going to come to your book signing. Okay, but I can only do one thing a day. Bye, call her tomorrow. She called the next day. Oh, I got a doctor's appointment. I can't do it. Okay, I'll call you tomorrow. Well, she ended up coming. So when I introduced her at the event, she got a standing ovation for like the 200 people that was there. And I felt like saying, God, if Doris wrote the book, would I sell more copies? Amanda Blake. She's from Buffalo. Okay, Amanda Blake is who? Miss Kitty. Okay, she went to grammar school and at Kenmore Lindbergh Elementary School. She went to junior high school in Hamburg, and in her junior year, she left Amherst High School because her father was transferred to California. When she got to California, she wanted to go into radio. So she ended up getting a job in radio, and what happened? They sent her to Buffalo because she got a job working for WEBI. Well, she was on radio, and she was doing really well, and she found out there was a show on radio called Gunsmoke, and she wanted to get the job in Miss Kitty, because it was going to be on TV. And she said, I want to be a madam. And her husband said, excuse me? And well, I didn't know what a madam was until Miss Kitty came about. You know, my dad said, we'll talk about that in a few years. Okay. Well, anyways, she ended up starting a thing for animals that worked in theater and television. Did a lot for animals. She started no-kill shelters. And you can see over here, she was being honored by Ronald Reagan. Why? She smoked 2 packs of cigarettes a day. She ended up getting lung cancer. So she became the spokesperson for the American Cancer Society. And there she is being honored by the greatest president in American history. Why is Reagan the greatest president in American history? He was born on my birthday. Oh, he's older than me. I was born on his birthday. Sorry, Ron. Okay. Now, the Weinstein family. Well, the Weinsteins were Russian Jewish students in Switzerland. And Anna met Boris in Switzerland, where she was getting her medical degree and he was becoming a pharmacist. Well, they were accused of trying to kill the Tsar. You know, why couldn't they do that to whoever's in charge of Russia right now? I'm not going to make any political statements. I can't say that because I'm part Russian. Okay. Well, anyways, so he ended up going to jail. And Anna said, well, I'm going to immigrate to the United States. She got to Ellis Island. When she got to Ellis Island, she said, I'm a medical doctor. I speak Polish, Ukrainian, Russian, and Yiddish. Where should I go? And they said, go to Buffalo, New York. And so she moved to Buffalo, became a doctor in Buffalo. Boris ended up coming and joining her. He opened some pharmacies here. And then all of a sudden, the Bolshevik Revolution happened. Because they had founded the American Socialist Party. Okay? And so he ended up going to Russia, and he became the secretary to Lenin. There's a picture of Weinstein with Lenin and Stalin. But Anna stayed in Western New York. Her son, Victor, also became a doctor. They became the biggest landowners in the Cheektowaga area. And we owe Rhinestone Park in Cheektowaga to the Rhinestones. If you don't go walking there, it's a fantastic place to go to. You really enjoy it. Now, Dorothy Thompson. How many of you heard of Dorothy Thompson? I never heard of Dorothy Thompson either until I started researching this. And when I found out that Dorothy Thompson was from Western New York, it made me really proud. She was born the daughter of a preacher who gave sermons really of more of love, happiness, and forgiveness, not the fire and brimstone with some preachers. She ended up growing in a parsonage of a church at 180 Union Road in Hamburg. Well, since she was the daughter of a Methodist minister, she got free tuition at Syracuse University. When I read that, I tried finding out why my father didn't become a minister. But anyways, well, after she graduated, she took a job in Buffalo working for the Women's Suffrage Party. And after women got the right to vote, she went to Europe. She worked as a journalist. And due to her ability in obtaining interviews, she was promoted as the first woman to head a foreign news bureau in England. In Europe, I mean. She was fluent in German. And she actually obtained an interview with the new chancellor by the name of Adolf Hitler. And this is back in 1931. And she didn't downplay his persecution of the Jewish people. She portrayed him as a dangerous little man. And she ended up doing an interview in a book saying, I saw Hitler, and she wrote in Cosmopolitan magazine. She was the first person in the world to warn the world about Hitler. And the Gestapo kept tabs on her, and she was the first journalist to be expelled from Germany by the Nazi regime. And she came back to the United States. She had radio shows. Her and Eleanor Roosevelt were considered the two most important women in the United States during that time after World War II. And where did she grow up? Right here in Western New York. Joyce Carol Oates is almost from around this area. She was also a writer. She grew up in a town called Millersport. You ever hear of a town called Millersport? Well, it's where Millersport and Trenton Road come together. That's Millersport. And so she had to take the bus to get to junior high school in Lockport, because there were no school buses yet. In fact, that's her parents' farm in the Millersport area. And almost all of her books have a reference in Niagara County. And her main book really talks about growing up inside Niagara County. And in 2011, she was awarded the National Humanities Medal by none other than President Obama. There's a picture of her being honored right there. Well, this person needs no introduction. What did she start? Chicken wings, right? We call them chicken wings. Okay, did you hear the story about how she started them? Okay, there's various different stories. I happen to believe the one that she said. My son was tending bar. His buddies came in and were drinking a lot, and they always spent a lot of money. I didn't have any food, so my son said, you gotta feed my guys. And she said, I don't have any food. And he said, you gotta find something, Mom. And so she was boiling some chicken wings for soup broth. So she took that out of there, she put them underneath the deep fryer, she put hot sauce on them, put celery on the side, and la, chicken wings were born. So, chicken wings became popular. In all of the United States and all over the world, what do they call them? Buffalo. What do we call them? Because we're in Buffalo. We don't have to call them that. Okay, Anya Franco started performing at the age of 9 playing Beatles songs. She started writing her own songs when she was 14. She graduated from performing arts at 16, started her own record label at the age of 19, and she did not want to sign with a recording label. She sold all her records originally out of the trunk of her car. Anya makes more money off any record she sells than the Beatles or Bruce Springsteen. But what does she do with that money? Okay, she ended up buying the Delaware Asbury Methodist Church at the corner of Delaware and Los Tupper, and it took $10 million to refurbish that church. And right now it's known as Asbury Hall at Batesville. Annie contributed 1/2 of the money, so she gave back to the Western New York area. I found out here, in fact, your society actually gave me a photo of Joan Baez, because Joan Baez looked weird when she was young. Clarence Center. And in fact, she lived, well, first her father was working as a physicist. Not really said where, but it was probably working for Carlsbad Corporation. And he converted to the Quaker faith when he was in Buffalo. You know, because of that, Joan Baez got involved in pacifism, which is what she was known for with a lot of her songs. And also, she was part Mexican, so she experienced discrimination when she was here. Now, that also is why she was one of the people that sang during Martin Luther King's March on Washington. And all of her life, she portrayed against the Civil War. She was for LGBT rights. But when she came here, she came because her home in Clarence Center was 3 houses away from where Flight 3407 crashed. So she wanted to come here to honor the people that had lived there. And I got a great photo of her. Now, Joanne Folletta. Okay, now she became the director of the Buffalo Philharmonic. What's important about that? She was the first female to be a conductor of a major philharmonic orchestra in the United States. She released over 120 recordings in her lifetime. The BPO is one of the biggest recording philharmonics in the United States. She was named one of the 50 greatest conductors of all time. And where does she work? Buffalo, New York. We can take credit for this woman, Lucille Ball. Okay, Lucille Ball really didn't look, well, I consider Jamestown part of Western New York, so that's why I include her. She was born at her grandparents' house in Jamestown. In fact, her grandmother was a midwife, so she actually delivered her when she was born. Lucy ended up growing up right next to Selwyn Amusement Park on Lake Chautauqua, which isn't there anymore. And she was a very precarious child. She had a habit of running away with guys coming up to Buffalo, and her parents would have to find her. One time she was in business class and she threw her typewriter at the teacher. So her mother said, I gotta do something with this girl. The only thing she cares about is theater. So she enrolled Lucy in a theater school in New York City when she was 17 years old. After one semester, the theater school called Mrs. Ball in Jamestown and said, Mrs. Ball, and she's thinking, they're gonna tell me how great Lucy's doing. They said, we're gonna save you some money. Take her out of school, she'll never make it. So Lucy didn't take that lightly. She came back to Jamestown. She worked as a clerk at a Walgreens drugstore. And she kept going back to New York. She became a model. But she couldn't become a fashion model because she entered a Miss New York State program campaign one year. And a photographer said to her mother, I'm sorry, I can't get any portraits because she's just not photogenic. So she was a clothes model. And there was a picture of her that was drawn by an artist, her wearing a chiffon dress. And she became known as the Chesterfield Girl. She was one of 12 women that were poster girls that were put in an Eddie Cantor film. She signed a contract for $125 a week. This is before World War II. That was good money. It was a 6-week contract, which got extended to 6 months to 6 years. She became in B movies. She got in the A movie. She ended up marrying her co-star, Desi Arnaz. How did she learn comedy? On the radio, a show called My Favorite Husband. Desi said, let's make that a television show. They took it to CBS. What did CBS say? Stinks. So they took it on the road, they got it down, and they ended up finally getting it on TV. By their 20th show, they were the top-rated program on television, which they held for 3 years. In January of 1951, little Ricky was born. Later that week, President Eisenhower was inaugurated as president. Who got better ratings? The birth of little Ricky, okay? And she also did a whole bunch of other things. She started Star Trek, Mission Impossible, and The Untouchables. In fact, if it wasn't for Lucy, we would not have Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock, because she saved that show from going on the air. Christine Baranski grew up in Buffalo. She ended up going to Villa Maria High School. She graduated in 1970. She's won a whole bunch of awards for everything she's done. Joan Bozer. Joan Bozer moved to Buffalo. She married Dr. Bozer. When she first came to Buffalo, she fell in love with the city. So what did she do? She started the Olmsted Parks Conservancy. And she worked along with a lady by the name of Minnie Gillette. Minnie Gillette happened to be the first black legislator on the Erie County Legislature. Together, they ended up saving ECC City Campus what used to be the post office. They ended up saving it as a campus. So because of these two women, we have the ECC campus downtown. Shirley Chisholm wasn't born in Buffalo. She was actually born in Brooklyn. And she was raised on a Caribbean island. I don't know her accent. And she received a BA from Brooklyn College, a master's from Columbia. In 1964, she was the second black woman elected to the New York State Legislature. She then was the first black woman elected to Congress in 1968. She was the founder of the Congressional Black Caucus, which is still in existence till this day. And she decided she was going to run for the nomination of the Democratic Party. Well, she didn't win, the nomination, but to me it was very important because I loved her platform. Her platform was, I am unbought and unbossed. Politicians out here, that should be your motto. You should care for your constituency, not for what your party tells you. And Shirley Chisholm did that when she was on the air. Barbara See's another goal. She wanted to become a history major. But when she ended up going to college, she found out they didn't want history teachers, so she became a French teacher. She also got her doctorate in counseling, and she worked for the Buffalo school system. And she ended up becoming the person in charge of the Buffalo Board of Education. But she started something called the Uncrowned Queens Institute at the University of Buffalo. And that's still in existence today, honoring African American women for their accomplishments in the Western New York area. And it now also honors black men for what they have done. And her father was a professional photographer. I said, Barbara, could you send me some photos that people might not have seen of you? She said, I'll send a picture of you when I was little, but I've seen her all my life on TV. I never expected her to have an afro. Charlotte Shred. She's really important. Everybody knows somebody that was touched by what Charlotte did. Her and her husband were both at Yale University in the 1960s. And someone came to speak there. And she was talking about something called hospice care. That they were treating people when they were critically and terminally ill, but they weren't doing anything for helping their psychological being. So she ended up going to that, and her husband were very influenced by what Dame Celia Saunders was talking about. So the first hospice was formed in New Haven, Connecticut. They moved to Buffalo, and Charlotte and her husband started the second hospice in the United States, right here in Western New York. But she took it a step further. It was Charlotte Shred that went to Albany and to Washington and got everything done for hospice to be accepted by the New York State and by the federal government. It's quite interesting that Charlotte ended up getting Alzheimer's disease, and she died at the hospice that she started right here in Chickawaga. Penny Wolfgang. Penny Wolfgang's a character. She's a judge, but everybody knows her from TV. She introduced me when I had my book released a couple weeks ago at the Buffalo History Museum. I became really good friends with Penny. Did anybody here ever meet Penny? Yeah, she's about this tall, right? Yeah. Oh, maybe this tall? Well, anyway, she told me, a judge is supposed to look important. Yeah. So she said, some judges sit on a book when they're behind the bench. I used to sit on an encyclopedia. And she's really great woman. She ended up getting involved in television, and that ended up making her a prominent judge. She ended up serving 28 years on the Supreme Court here in New York State. And she's still active in radio. I just did an interview with her a couple of weeks ago, and of course she introduced me at that event. And last but not least is, I was reading this book. I got a telephone call from Zonta. Anybody know what Zonta is? It's the largest women's club in the United States. It was started right here in Western New York at the Statler Hotel. And they asked me to speak at one of their get-togethers. And they're the biggest women's club in the world. And so the woman I was talking to was Christine Zimbia. And I said, well, I'm writing a book about prominent women. And she says, why ain't I in the book? And I said, who are you? And she said, I'm Christine Zimbia. And I said, so? She said, where are you from? Chickawaga. you gotta know who I am. I said, I don't know who you are. And she said, let me tell you something. Okay, she said, I moved to Maryville High School area in Cheektowaga, and I wanted to become a police officer. So I graduated from Maryville and enrolled at ECC. I ended up going to the policeman's class, and when I walked in, the guy in charge said, I'm sorry, lady, you're in the wrong room. Secretary was down the hall. And she says, no, I want to become a policeman. And I said, oh, okay. So she graduated #1 in her class. Okay, when she was there, she also got a job working part-time at the University of Buffalo. And she took an exam for police officers. She got the highest score. So there was an opening in Cheektowaga. She got the job as the first female police officer in Cheektowaga. She said, when I became a police officer, there were problems. #1, my buttons were on the wrong side. #2, they had no hat. They wanted me to wear a crossing guard cap, and she said, no, I'm a police officer, I get a policeman's cap. And she said, and they gave me my raincoat, and it ended up going down to my ankles. You know, there were problems with that. But she said, Rick, you know what was the worst thing? They made me wear a bulletproof vest. A woman's body is not made for a bulletproof vest. They had to redesign the bulletproof vest so that women could wear them because there was some obstruction inside of that vest. So she said because of that it changed. I said, okay. She said, well then, I took a test to be a lieutenant. I got the highest score. So an opening came up in Cheektowaga for a lieutenant. Who got the job? Christine Zibio. She was the first female lieutenant on the major police force. So she took the test again for police commissioner. And she got the highest score. And so Cheektowaga needed a new chief of police. She became the first female chief of police of a major municipality in the United States. And where did she live? Buffalo, New York. Now, when a police officer retires, they do something called the retirement final salute. There's a retirement final salute. You walk out and everybody salutes you. Every police car on duty ends up taking you back to your home. Well, she retired in like March. She lived in Cheektowaga. So a snowstorm started right when they did the final salute. So a Cheektowaga police plow had to lead the way to Christine's house with all the other police cars with their lights flashing, following. But she was the first female police officer. Okay, so that ended up being my book on the spirit of Buffalo women. That information was all drawn from these 3 books. And from the books, I ended up writing another book just recently called Historic Places of Buffalo and Western New York. I was honored when I got here today. 2 people already bought the book. One lady over there has, and she said, will you sign it for me? And I said, if you pay me for it again. And she said, that's not fair. I said, okay. And so also somebody bought a book and donated it to the association. So that's the end of my talk, so I'm going to ask my questions now. My goals. #1, did I bring up things that you never knew before? #2, did I bring up some things that you might have known before but you've forgotten about and now you remembered? Yeah. What's my name? Okay, there we go. Okay. #3, okay, after you heard about these amazing women that came from Buffalo and all these fantastic things that started with people from the Western New York area, are you proud to be from Buffalo and Western New York? Oh, come on now. Are you proud to be from Buffalo? Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Uh-oh, I said something wrong. The boss is coming.
Thank you, Rick, so much. Thank you for being here tonight. Safe travels home. Our last program for this year will be November 11th. So we hope to see you all then. Safe trip home. Thank you very much.